Okay, so a number of forces that are operating the economy at the moment. You're aware of these high-profile job losses that are happening, that are undermining how people feel about their job security. So really, the most important puzzles around the economy at the moment are: the first one, has business decided that after 4 or 5 years of focusing on cost-cutting, raising productivity, and being quite uncertain to launch into substantial employment and investment plans, has the tide turned with regard to the attitude of business? And the second one is from the perspective of the household sector, the consumer, who has, when the global financial crisis hit, they got quite frightened. They raised their savings rate to about 10%, and since then it hasn't budged. Are they starting to feel more confident whereby they could start cutting their savings rate, taking advantage of the rise in their house prices and spending at a faster pace their incomes are growing at? They're the two real puzzles that the economy is facing at the moment. They're the puzzles. The certainties that we know is that the mining boom is winding back, and that's going to take a substantial amount of money out of the economy. The second thing we know for sure is that the government is going to constrain government spending. Government spending will add about half as much to growth as it has been over previous years. Not only the federal government, but also the state governments, as a result of their wanting to maintain their ratings in a situation where their revenues remain under pressure. The third one that's not entirely agreed to, but I think is pretty clear, is that China's going to decelerate next year, this year. China really wants to restructure their economy. They want to move away from an export, infrastructure, investment-driven economy to a consumer-based economy. That means that you have to invest more in what they call safety nets. That's health, education, pension scheme, and that doesn't have a big growth multiplier. Also, the Chinese want to encourage more confidence in their consumption goods, and that means that a lot of Chinese producers will have to leave the market because they're not attaining the standards of consumption goods that the authorities would like, because without that standard, then Chinese will remain sceptical about consuming their own consumer goods. The indirect effect is much more important through what we call the wealth effect. So if people's house prices are going up, will they be prepared to do what they did before the GFC and start drawing down equity in their houses and spending at a much faster pace than their incomes were growing at? I think the jury's out on a lot of those situations, and that's why I think it's still possible that we might see lower interest rates. But by the same token, we could easily see a situation where interest rates could jump pretty sharply. So now is not a time to be taking on a lot of risk, because even though my central view is for some modest falls, you'll notice that my view on the fixed rates are fairly modest drops in the fixed rates. And that's because if these rate cuts do occur, the market will say, that means that they're going to have to raise rates next year. So the market won't really push the fixed rates down by very much. But if the reverse happens and I'm wrong, and they start raising rates in the second half of this year, and the market is sort of anticipating that, then these rates could move really quickly. So the risk return at the moment is balanced against holding out, remaining totally floating, because even if I'm right, you might make 20 basis points, and if you're wrong, you could lose a lot. The reason why I think they can cut rates is really just around the answers to those two questions. Is business ready to start moving away from a cost-cutting, productivity drive mentality and start investing and employing? And is the consumer ready to start cutting their savings rate? Now, my view is that neither is the case, but there's a lot of people that believe that it is the case, that business is ready to start moving and that people are prepared to start cutting their savings rate. And in that situation, growth will pick up a lot more rapidly than I'm expecting. In the case of New South Wales, there's been a very, very welcome rise in population growth. You can see how population growth in Australia and New South Wales dipped markedly after the GFC, when immigration was constrained because of the sharp rise in the unemployment rate. Governments were worried about adding more people to the population when the unemployment rate was high. There's been a degree of optimism now returned. However, if we think that unemployment is a key driver of immigration policy, then bear in mind that last week the unemployment rate registered 6%. That's the highest level that we've seen for 10 years. That's right, it's higher than the level that it reached during the global financial crisis. So the labour market story remains a real constraint on how this economy is evolving. In the case of New South Wales, clearly, the great story is with regard to dwelling approvals. You can see the grey line. Approvals are now back growing at nearly a 40% pace. We saw that in 2009 for a short period of time, but that's when the Reserve Bank whacked up interest rates and really slowed the party down really quickly. Obviously, the main difference this time and in 2009 was that in 2009 they were using the terminology, we have to make way for the mining boom. So we have to slow down the non-mining part of the economy to create enough resources to service mining. This time around, of course, it's, hey, what are we going to do to fill the gap that's going to be created by the slowdown in mining? So that means that that particular psychology won't be as operative. But what has changed, of course, is that the dollar's come down, inflation pressures have risen, and of course we've seen spectacular increases in house prices and in credit growth that the Reserve Bank would be feeling a little unnerved about. The good news is that after years and years and years of underperformance, look at that story on growth in approvals for New South Wales. Basically from the Olympics until the 2009 recovery, approvals contracted every year. They fell. And we reached this ludicrous situation where Victoria was completing twice as many houses as New South Wales and more than New South Wales and Queensland combined. We've gone through that and the approval numbers are looking very, very encouraging indeed. I think when I saw you 18 months ago, I said by far the best housing market over the next period is going to be the Sydney market. I'll have a look back through the records, but I was certainly saying that to you. And of course, the Sydney market has outperformed the others in a spectacular way. If we look at the 6-month annualised pace of Sydney house price growth, now running at 20%, Melbourne about 10% and Brisbane at about 6%. So that's a huge outperformance by the Sydney market. And the reason why I was always confident that would happen was because Sydney had a massive catch-up to occur. Given that interest rates were so low, house prices were the first thing that would definitely respond. Over the last 10 years, even with this latest lift in prices, Sydney prices are up 50% and Melbourne and Brisbane are up by about 100%. So Sydney was always going to be in a catch-up mode. Is now a good time to buy a dwelling? And the New South Wales survey peaked around June this year and has come off by about 15%. Victoria's come off by about 10%, whereas Queensland has remained solidly strong. Western Australia's come off. Now, this is what I would call an affordability issue. So when people are asked, is now a good time to buy, they go, well, you know, prices have gone up a fair way, maybe it's not. So this would be, to me, would be one red flag to suggest that at least the locals might be starting to feel a bit stretched. So if, for instance, we get another 10 or 15% in Sydney in 2014, I would think that time to buy measure will be starting to look really stretched and we'll have to go through a period of low activity in order for people to restore their confidence. Are house prices in Australia overvalued? I get this all the time. Joe said I'm going overseas on Thursday. I'll go and talk to these hedge funds. I'll go and talk to these global investors that invest in Westpac. And the question will always be, Australian house prices are overvalued by 40%. And the way they get that is to look at rental yields. But the rental yield model hasn't worked for the last 20 years and it still doesn't work. The way I look at it is price-income ratios. And over the last 10 years, if we look at prices for Australia, the black line, against income growth, you can see they pretty much match them. So in the last 10 years, house prices have not really run ahead of incomes. Basically what we've seen is that we've seen steady income growth and some volatility in house prices, and we're now at a point where house prices are sort of edging ahead, but nothing like the imbalances. However, it's not a common story around the country Sydney house prices are still lagging behind incomes. So there's still some catch-up possible in the Sydney market without creating any major imbalances. But the other big issue around this particular cycle has been the absence of first home buyers and the huge dominance of investors. So new lending to investors is up by 40%, new lending to owner-occupiers is up 26%, and first home buyers are actually down. They're basically being left out of the market. Firstly, because they can't get the grant on only new stuff, and with regard to the new stuff, they're getting really just priced out of the market by international investors. There's plenty of examples where new developments are sold off the plan 100% to international investors, some from the mainland of China, some local Chinese. But the first home buyer is basically out of the market. That's creating some social problems because prices are continuing to rise and their affordability is getting squeezed. So one of my jobs is to predict to the bank what's going to go on in terms of the demand for credit. Because for a bank, it's credit growth that really drives their sales and drives their profitability. I'm not sure what's driving investors. If I look at the Sydney market, you can see where the investor activity is rampant relative to other states. Sydney now up by about 50%. If we compare Sydney investors in the last time we had a boom, which was 09-10, when they were borrowing around 2.5 billion, now they're up to 4 billion. So the investor story in the Sydney market is much stronger than it was in that 09 period. Victoria is looking okay, but it's really a real driver of this market at the moment is investors in the Sydney market. That time to buy stuff I pointed out to you has a very close statistical relationship with owner-occupiers. We're very confident that demand from owner-occupiers is going to flatten out, but we can't determine what drives investors. Obviously, rental yields are a factor. And the rental yield story is still very attractive. If you look at the black line there, which is a net floating mortgage rate, and you look at the investor yield in the Sydney market, they've pretty much closed the gap entirely. So that's why it's very, very attractive for investors. And the Sydney investment yield is still very, very much more attractive than it is for the Melbourne market. So the Sydney market, by all counts to me, valuation, investor returns looks to be much more attractive. Thank you very much.
Netstrata is a strata management company. We're based in Sydney. We specialise in the setup of new strata developments and working with developers in handing or transitioning their projects on completion through to the new owners and facilitate that transfer and then undertake the ongoing management from that point onwards. We've been established since 1996. We've got a strong track record with working with a lot of clients, a lot of members of the Australian Lebanese Chamber of Commerce that we've dealt with over the past almost 20 years. And we continue to build strong relationships with our clients, and it's something that we pride ourselves on as a business. What brought Netstrata to the Australian Lebanese Chamber of Commerce? Basically, we had a number of clients which were members, and we saw what the Chamber was offering to its members and the kind of people that it was attracting, and it certainly suited our needs as far as a client base, as there's a lot of developers that are associated with the Chamber. The information that's provided to the members is also very specific to the markets, like we've seen today with Bill Evans joining the Chamber to give his forecasts on the Sydney property market, which is certainly of a strong interest to us, as our business is derived on strata projects and developments, and there's a lot of developers here that we work with. The Chamber has certainly brought some fantastic speakers in over the years, and I've been to many events. Today was great with Bill Evans. It's not every day that you get to get very close and get one-on-one with Bill Evans like he did for us today. Hearing his forecast and his knowledge on the Sydney property market, which is of strong interest to us and a lot of the actual the members here. So that was fantastic and very insightful. Netstrata have been sponsors since I think about 2006, 2007, so we've maintained a good close working relationship with the Chamber. The events that they provide give us a fantastic opportunity to be able to network, to be able to promote our brand to the membership. The membership base is very strong with a lot of successful leaders in business. The focus of Netstrata is obviously the property industry, and there's a very strong membership of people in that field. So it essentially lets us get our brand and gives us the opportunity to communicate, what we can do for them as a strata management business.